Can't sing anymore. Well, hello and welcome to the Homeless Consultant channel. My name is Paul B. I am the Homeless Consultant. And I promised you that I was going to tell you something about computer modeling and guitars. And that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm playing a real guitar, but I'm playing it through my computer, through a computer model. This is not an amplifier that you're hearing. Can you believe that? This is, let me show you what I mean. With the click of a mouse, I will change this to, let's see. Here we go. Click of a mouse. You'll have to forgive me, my hands are absolutely frozen cold out here. This is all I have to work with when I live in a car. So I have to heat up my hands once in a while so I don't have to get my fingers amputated. Let me show you something else here. I'm going to go back to that first... No, I'm going to go to a different amplifier here. This one models Marshall amplifiers, if you've ever heard of Marshall amps. And you might notice some bands that are known for playing Marshall amps. For example, whoops. My hands are too cold. Okay, so that's a Marshall amp that this is modeling. But notice if I play another song, it sounds pretty much correct. Except my hands are so frozen, I can't even... Golly, I can't do anything. Been a long time since I rock and roll. Alright, so that was the same model, but it's used in two different songs for the most part, and that's because the two bands in question basically used similar gear or similar sounding gear. Let me go to one more here for you. This one models a heavy metal amplifier, which is going to be a ball when I can't move my fingers. Let's see. Okay, so that model's something different. But all of this is being done in the computer, this little laptop computer. And frankly, I can pull up just about anything I want in here. In fact, let me try something else. We'll see if this works. If not, I will edit it out. Now once again, because of the extreme cold, I'm going to have to bring everything into my car. I'll show you a clip of what it looks like in here just to set up for this one shot. All the wires and things that I had to take out just to get this done. I'm going to pull back into my turtle shell and get in here and warm up, and then I'll take it from there with the rest of this episode on computer models. Okay, welcome back inside my home here. Make sure you take off your shoes. I've been sitting in the car for about 20 minutes with a heat pack, and I've finally have the use of my appendages back. So what I'm going to do real quick here before it gets too dark, I'm going to lay down this part about guitar modeling. So let me show you what I just did, alright? I'm going to intersperse between me and some pictures that I just took in front of me. And forgive the camera for shaking, but I can't see where I'm moving the mouse and the camera. Basically, I have various programs on my computer that simulate guitar amplifiers. You know, like the famous brands would be Fender, Marshall, Orange, you know, where this comes from. There's all these different great brands of Dumble and geez, all of a sudden I can't think of any. Randall, you know, there's all kinds of amplifiers, and they all have they're either analog or digital. If they're analog, it means that that the amplifier uses discrete components. In other words, the electrical signal is going through things that modify that signal on the spot, you might say, like a vacuum tube or a diode or a resistor or a capacitor, something like that. And that's what the traditional amps, you know, from the 60s, they were all that way. Then they started coming out with transistors, and then they became digital, where they have a little computer chip in there. The signal comes into the amplifier, the computer more or less alters the sound and then converts it back to analog to output to the speakers. Now, an amplifier for a guitar can either have it can be what's called a head. A head is just the amplifier and the controls, and it outputs the hot signal, and you have to plug that into some kind of a speaker cabinet. So it could just be one little 8-inch speaker, or it could be a huge wall of 4x12 speakers, or anything in between, 2x10s, whatever you want, 2 10-inch speakers. A combo amp combines the two. That's what most people have in their bedroom. You just pick it up with a handle. It has the amplifier section at the top, and it has a speaker built into it. Sometimes you can run a cable out from that to a different cabinet if you prefer. And then if you want to record what you're playing on guitar, the most effective way to do it to make it sound organic is to put a microphone in front of the amplifier and record literally the sound coming out of the speaker. The reason I tell you all of this is because what I'm about to show you are, and keep in mind, these programs cost me like $30 a piece. I mean, for a couple of them, the first 3 amps you're going to see cost me about $30 a piece. I really love these Kuasa amps. Here's the first one. It's called Vermilion, and it is basically a model of Fender amps, specifically like a Fender Reverb, Deluxe Reverb, something like that. Now, if you look at this, notice that it looks like an amplifier. It looks a lot like a Fender amp. For trademark reasons, they don't make it look exactly the same. But it has all the knobs and controls on it. So it has the volume and the gain. It has the equalization, you know, low, mid, and high equalization. It might have reverb or chorus, you know, whatever kind of effects are built into the real amp. And you can turn those knobs with the mouse. Now, there's presets in there that allow you to save the settings, and that's what gives you a different tone. That's the difference between when I played Folsom Prison Blues by Johnny Cash, that had a real chicken picking sound to it, although not so much in this car. I couldn't get the sound I wanted quickly enough. And another setting on the exact same amplifier, which was the one I opened with, which was Limelight by Rush. Okay, and notice below you'll see the cabinet. You can't really see the speakers through the grill on that, but you see 2 microphones down there. Now, when I went to Back in Black and Led Zeppelin's Rock and Roll, I went to this amplifier, also by Kuasa. This is called Caliburn. This one models Marshall amplifiers. And anyone who knows amplifiers is probably going to recognize right away that color scheme. But it's basically the same thing, but the modeling going on inside is very different. It's meant to sound like a Marshall amp, not like a Fender amp. And Marshall is more like the classic rock sound of the 1970s, you might say. You know, Back in Black, obviously. The Fender is going to be a little more associated with, say, the bands of the 60s, you know, the Beatles kind of thing, although the Beatles more or less used Vox amps, which I love. And, but notice it's the same thing. Now, let's take a closer look at those microphones. Watch how I can actually move the microphone back and forth on this model with the mouse. I can just drag it. And in fact, I can go in there and I can change which microphone I have. They have a selection. The microphones themselves are models. They're modeling the characteristics, the recording characteristics of different real-world microphones. And if you look really closely, you might be able to see the speaker in there. In fact, first let's go to the next amp, the third amp that I use for the Iron Maiden song. This one's called Cream, or they probably pronounce it Creme or something like that. They're in France, I think, or Italy. And this amp is meant to model heavy metal type amps, although I didn't really get super heavy metal in what I played, or the sound that I used. But notice it's a different looking amp, but it has basically the same controls as any amp would have. But this one, you're not going to play Johnny Cash songs on it. Okay, it's too hot. It's going to sound something more like Metallica or Megadeth or Slayer or something like that. I eased up a bit on it to get the Iron Maiden because my hands are too cold to play anywhere near that fast. Now, look really closely. Do you see the speaker? Do you see the speaker in there? This one, I believe, is a 2x10. I'm not looking at it as I talk, by the way. I'll add the visuals later. I believe it's a 2x10, so it has two speakers in there. You can see the speakers in the background. You can also go in there and change the speakers to a different type of speaker. Now, guess what? That is also a model. The computer is modeling the broadcast characteristics, the sound characteristics of different speakers. And in some of these programs, you can nail it down to a specific speaker. You want to hear a PV Black Widow, you just choose it. Something like that. Just like if you want to use a Neumann TLM 103 microphone, you just choose it. And of course, the amplifier you're choosing to begin with. Now, before I talk in detail about this, let's look at another couple of these really quick. The next one I'm going to look at is called Amplitude. And there's no way in a car I can tape me using this thing, so I'm just going to film it and tell you about it. This is an official modeler of Fender amps and some others. You know, SVT and Orange, things like that. So this one has real official models endorsed by the manufacturers for things like Fender and Orange again. And if you look, these amps look more like a Fender amp. It has the same grill pattern, it has the logo, no trademark violation, things like that. And again, they sound very similar to the real thing. And in a program like this, it has all kinds of things. It has a looper, it has all kinds of effects pedals in there. I'll show you here. If you take a blank board, you know, like a pedal board, if you play guitar live, you have a pedal board on the floor and you hit it with your feet, and that's how you change the sounds. If you want to add delay, you click the delay pedal. If you want to turn off the distortion and go to a clean channel, you turn it off, click on it. Well, watch here. I'll go ahead and I'll add a fuzz. So I'm going to add a fuzz pedal that's part of the Jimi Hendrix collection. This models one of the fuzz pedals that Jimi Hendrix himself actually used. Okay, and then I can go in there and add all these pedals. I can shift them, I can move them back and forth relative to each other, because when you play one pedal into the other, it sounds different than if you reverse them sometimes. Alright, the last thing I'm going to show you is the BBE board. BBE makes some of the coolest guitar pedals out there. Those little things that go on the floor. And again, they're effects. They take the sound of your guitar, they might cause it to be distorted versus clean, or it might have the delay. It might have a phaser, that sound. It might have a flanger in it, which simulates when they had the old reel-to-reel tape decks, you know, they're kind of spinning like this. If you touch the flange, it would slow it down and it'd make the sound kind of warble a bit. Tremolo is where the sound is kind of come and the volume's coming in and out. And you get that a lot in the old surf music. Okay, so let's leave it at that as far as visuals in the interest of time. I mean, I could go on all day about computer modeling of guitar stuff. It is unbelievable. Here's the point I want to make. These models, as you heard, sound like the real thing. And it makes you wonder, why would someone, if you can spend $30 on Vermilion and get basically a model of a beautiful Fender amplifier, why would you go out and spend $1,900 on one at the store? And I have to be honest with you, I don't have a really good answer for that. Except that if you want to play live with it, but the real answer is the real amplifier does sound better. It sounds more organic, it sounds more real, and it is real. It is the real thing. Remember, a model is a representation, but it will always be inferior. Because if the model ever got to the point where it was exactly the same as the real thing, it would no longer be a model, it would be the real thing. It would be another Fender Deluxe Reverb coming off the assembly line. So the computer modeling that it's doing here is fantastic. To most people's ears, they're not going to know the difference. And when you put it in a mix, as you're mixing a song with the drums and the bass guitar and the singing and all that, most people aren't going to notice the difference. I would dare say nobody can. There's a lot of pretentious people out there who say, I don't sound anything like the real thing. But the truth is, I mean, that's just snobbery. And this is what I wanted to point out to you. I told you in the last video, computer modeling of guitar gear is so phenomenally good. Listen to how much that sounds like the real amplifier, and you just got the tiniest itty bitty taste of what I can do with a guitar living in a car. And that's only the 3 programs I showed you. You know, I mean, I still have a lot of software from when I had a home. I could spend days showing you all the stuff I have here. I have things that simulate DJ turntables. You know, I can simulate doing a DJ set with a modeler for DJ gear. There's a vinyl simulator. It models the sound the noise that's introduced on a vinyl turntable. So if I come up with something that's really nice, but I want to make it sound like maybe I produced it in the 70s, I would do some equalization tricks so it sounds like that from that era. And then I use this program to add in pops and scratches and skips, you know, and dust, the sound of dust, the needle hitting dust. And it's really hard to tell the difference, except that most people overdo it a bit. Okay, so these are computer models. They are representations of things in the real world, in this case in music gear. And keep in mind, I have another amp from Kawasa. It's called Cerberus. It's a bass amplifier. So when I have my bass guitar, I can play through that. It's kind of like an SVT amp. And I can play different varieties of bass guitar and effects as well. With my Arturia collection, I have like Arturia Spark. You saw that drum machine in the Police video briefly. That's a drum machine. I can tap on it and it will model the sounds of different drums. It could, for example, model the sound of those electronic drums from the 1980s. You know, those kinds of Thomas Dolby things. It can literally model it with algorithms in the computer, or it can use sampling. Sampling is how I'm turning the noise that my neighbors made, which made me homeless. I'm taking the sounds that they injected into my home and I'm turning them into drums as samples. These are literally real recordings of the noise. And I can sit on a drum machine and just boom, crash, refrigerator drop, scream, bang against the wall, door slam, foot stomp. And I can sit there and I can play drums that are literally playing back the sounds just like that of what my neighbors did to terrorize me for all those years. I call it making lemonade. What else can you do? I'm making another drum set where I'm in the car and I record me tapping on this with hands, clicking knobs, opening doors, closing doors, with the drumsticks up on the wheel. And when I get done with that one, then let's say I get a home again, which I sure hope I do, then I can sit inside my home and I can still replicate the sounds that I'm making in this car as I'm out here doing my stuff. That is amazing. If you think about it, that is absolutely amazing. That you could sit inside, you can live in a car, and in theory, although not in practice for a variety of reasons, you need a little more workspace, you need more power requirements. I can't fit the guitar in here unless the door's open. Look how quick my hands froze. But in theory, I could produce an entire album in this car, and the listener wouldn't even know that I wasn't in some big, huge studio paying $1,000 a night. They would have no way to know the difference. That's how good the modeling is for music gear. Now, part of it is because of the consumer demand for that, but the other reason is because of the way the modeling is done. And remember, in the last video I told you, the way the modeling is done for these kinds of guitar gear is fundamentally different than what you're dealing with these computer models for, you know, the spread of disease and viruses, the things that governors are using to base their decisions on. That is the reason I'm going into so much detail on this guitar stuff, because I want you to understand the distinction. If you don't understand the distinction, then when you encounter things like these computer models of guitar gear, you might think that the CDC has something for disease that's comparable to that. They don't. They don't. What they have is comparable to, instead of what the CD has is, instead of what I just played for you and showed you, something a little more like this. And that's the problem. So as much as I want to talk about guitar gear, I'm going to have to move on to something else. Before it gets dark, I want to talk about computer models that are in the same genre. Same general genre. And before I do, I should mention one thing about with the guitar gear. There's two basic ways that you can model. Remember, with a model, you're using a computer to try to represent or abstract something in the real world. A guitar. There's even software out there that I can play an electric guitar and it'll sound just like a nice open acoustic guitar. I mean the real thing, not this. Or vice versa. I could play an acoustic guitar and it would sound like a lead shredder guitar, some kind of Ibanez or something. It's amazing, absolutely amazing. And look at the cost for these things. It's ludicrous. They're cheap. They're so much cheaper than the real thing. But the two ways that you can do it, you can do what the code breakers did in World War II. You can put some computer programmers in a room, and through sheer intellectual brute force, they start creating algorithms that take a signal. So if you have a signal coming in from a guitar, you've got, you know, if you look at the sine wave of it, they take that and they start to modify the sound using mathematics. So they program the computer, take the signal and distort it. Now, what does that mean, to distort something? Well, you heard the different types of distortion here. The Rush song had a different type of distortion. It was a little heavier and chorusy. It was a little warbly, more than the AC/DC and Led Zeppelin, which is much more dry. And then the Iron Maiden one was much heavier, thick distortion. Now, I didn't play any fuzz for you, but, you know, Jimi Hendrix, fuzz. Fuzz is where it's just going berserk. It's almost out of control. The distortion is so much. But if you take this signal, if you have a nice signal coming in and you add distortion to it, it's kind of like adding the dust and the pops from a vinyl album, but you're distorting the signal. Well, what you hear in your ears when you play that back is a distorted guitar. So you create different algorithms that change the type of the way that it distorts that signal, and you hear it as a different type of distortion. One might be appropriate for playing Slayer songs and thrash metal. Another might be more appropriate for something a little more laid back, like modern country rock. Okay. Now also with effects, if you want to have something delay, if you play guitar bling and you want it to go bling 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 bling, well, how do you do that? As a computer programmer, what you do is the sounds coming in, based on how the people set those knobs on the software, it will take whatever length of sound that you want it to. It'll take a copy of it, and it'll play it back X number of times at the interval or the changing interval that you've specified where you set the knobs. And you've got delay. Bling, 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 bling. It's as simple as that. If you want chorus, then you take a signal, you make a copy of it, and you take another one, and you move them back and forth relative to each other. And it creates this kind of ensemble sound, as if you have two playing instead of one. But you're doing it through sheer brute force. As a programmer, you're thinking in terms of, I want to take this signal, and I'm going to write a mathematical equation that does an logical, not just mathematical, but logical equation that changes and morphs this signal coming into the computer and then sends it out. That's the super duper 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 simplified version of what these things are doing. The other way to do it is, and this is in theory the best way, it probably is the best way. In those real amplifiers, remember I told you like an analog amplifier has resistors and capacitors, diodes, transformers, it has tubes, it has all these different analog components in the amplifier. These are the things that can break, that can burn out, and that makes your $2,000 amplifier a brick until you get it fixed. Alright? Which doesn't happen with the software, which is another advantage. Remember, I've talked in other videos in Junk Science about the laws of electronics. There are various laws. Ohm's law is probably the most well-known one. You know, it has to do with resistance. And by obeying those laws in the mathematics, what you can do is you can take just a resistor. All a resistor does is when a signal comes through, some electricity comes through, the resistor literally resists it. It's like if you're walking down the street and a high wind comes, it becomes resistance against you, and you have to, you have to put a little more energy into moving at the same pace you were before. That's kind of what a resistor does in the analog world. A capacitor stores up electricity, so electricity comes into it, and this thing can store like a little mini battery for a moment. It can store up a charge, but at the same time, when you want it to, it can discharge all of that. And that has its own purpose. A diode lets the signal in just one direction. So if you have a diode there and the signal's coming in, it can go through that way, but there's no way to make it come back this way. It gets stopped. Okay, a light emitting diode. The thing goes in there, and when it goes in, it causes it to emit light. That's an LED. Just like your LED television, your LED, somewhere I've got LED flashlight. That's what an LED is. It's a light emitting diode. So there's all these components, and they follow natural laws. They follow laws of electronics. They're mathematical laws. So the other way to program these, which is fascinating, is to create a programmer's toolkit. Let's say you're going to focus on just modeling a resistor. So if you have a 220 ohm resistor, this is what happens when the signal comes in. You program that into the computer. If you have 1,000 ohm resistor or something, this is going to happen. They might be able to handle different high voltage versus line level signals and things like that. So the programmer will actually create a toolkit that models the resistor itself, the characteristics of the resistor. Now, if you cut open a resistor and look at it with a magnifying glass, you'll see all this kind of like chalky, dusty, like sandstone-ish kind of, I'm saying this wrong, but you know what I mean. There's something inside of it. What about if there's some impurities in one of those? It's going to change the way that resistor works. And that manifests itself big time when you get something more complicated, like a transformer or a tube. Okay? So if you're going to model individual components of electronic devices, you have to take all of that into consideration. In 1965, why did John Lennon buy this Fender amp? Paul McCartney bought the exact same amp, but they don't quite sound exactly the same. They bought the same model from the same store at the same time, but they're not exactly the same. It's because of those little impurities and subtle differences in the components of each amplifier. And that's part of the beauty of analog. That's the beauty. You can't really simulate that for the reason I'm describing here. There's so much that can go wrong with the manufacturing process, although it may turn out to be a good thing in practice, but you can't model it. So there's limitations to what you can do. But imagine that people have sat down and created these computer programs that model a resistor and a capacitor and a tube, and it models it based on whatever parameters you want to put in there. I want to use 100 microfarad capacitor, whatever. All right, I want to use a 12AX7 tube. I want to use a soft tack tube, or whatever kind of components you want to use. Once somebody has programmed each of these components, you can start adding them together in a bigger computer program, and it simulates a signal going through a resistor, then a capacitor, then a diode, then a tube, etc. And guess what you get? If you have the schematics, the drawings that tell you how they design this particular amplifier, you can literally just put the components together from the blueprint. And in theory, when you use I had to use an interface. I don't know if you saw it in the car. I had to use this interface. This interface between my guitar and my computer. This is what tells my computer what it is that my guitar is playing, so that it can send the information to the software. Well, if you have all that stuff set up, in theory, if you connect all these virtual components in the computer the way that the blueprint says to do it on a real amplifier, then when I plug a guitar in here and I run that software, it should sound and behave exactly like the real amp. To me, that is the goal. That is the goal of computer modeling. When you do that, you're going to get the best results, and that's exactly why you get the best results with things like this. Now, again, it's not perfect, but a lot of these programs actually show you can flip the program around. You can flip the amplifier around in the computer screen, and you can see the discrete components in there. It shows a picture of them, the tubes and everything, and you can actually go in there and you can swap out this tube for that tube. You can change the characteristics. You can change which electronic components are in this virtual amplifier. That's awesome. And in fact, if you're designing a new amplifier, that's pretty useful because it gives you a starting point, doesn't it? You can go in there and you can set up things, see how they work, and then you can go build one in the real world based on what you did in the model. And in theory, again, it should come out sounding like the model did. Only it'll probably sound better because it's real. There's always this digitization going on, this analog to digital conversion and digital to analog conversion going on in a computer that degrades the sound. And a real amplifier doesn't have that. So those are the two main ways that you can model guitar gear. And then, of course, I guess the third way is to combine the two to some extent. You can do some brute force, and you can do this kind of component level modeling and just follow blueprints or write your own blueprints of an amplifier. Now, the key here is what I mentioned about the impurities. Each of these components in the real world are not pure. They follow natural laws, but there's impurities in the materials used to build these tiny little components. And they have an impact on how that thing functions in the real world. This resistor may function differently than this one. It's very subtle. You might need, special electronics analytical gear to notice that they're doing something different. But sometimes they manifest themselves a little more forcefully, such as this component worked fine, but this one had a problem, and this one caused the blackout of a major city for 3 days. Something like that. Those little impurities can make a big, big difference. Huge difference. And we will never, ever, ever be able to model exactly what these things do in the real world for that reason. And I want you to remember that when we get to modeling disease models. I want you to remember that, please. Something this good that does such a fantastic job of modeling still is a complete and utter failure when it comes to modeling the subtle nuances of what actually happens in the real world. And I'm going to get to the disease stuff later. Before the sun goes down, I want to take this just a little bit further. There are other software modelers out there that are very, in terms of a genre, they're similar to what I just showed you with the guitar stuff. These would be, they're usually called simulators, not models. The word's used interchangeably, but that's not correct exactly. Well, not correct exactly. The word simulator, it deals more with intent than what it actually is. A model deals with what it is. It's a representation or an abstraction of something that exists in the real world or in our imagination. A simulation is something that intends, which is interpreted through the human mind. You know, this can of soda can't determine what intent is. It doesn't have that ability. Humans do. And intent is an abstraction. So that's why I put these models into their own category. These are simulators, and you've probably heard of or played flight simulators, like Microsoft Flight Simulator or X-Plane or something like that. And what do? They model the way that the aerodynamic characteristics of an aircraft, and they give you an interface through the computer and maybe through joystick and things like that, where you can pretend to fly a plane, and if the graphics are good enough, you can have a lot of fun. You can probably somewhat learn how to fly a plane without ever stepping into a plane. I'd be a little worried to go do it without a trainer, going straight no matter how many hours I played a simulator, stepping into a 747 or even a Cessna for that matter. But the fact is, you're going to be a lot better off than Joe Average, who's never done anything with an aircraft. You have a better chance of being able to fly or land that thing than anyone else. Now, they're doing the same thing, but don't forget, an aircraft is incredibly complex. And while they are able to model the mathematics of the aerodynamics of how wings work and the drag created by this type of engine and things like that, you know, they're able to model the going through the atmosphere. Is the plane going to stall or not? Is it rising to, is it going along and losing speed and it's in peril of stalling? Well, if that's the case, then you need to nose down to pick up speed to prevent a stall. The computer model is able to simulate all of those things, but it's able to simulate it by sheer intellectual brute force of the programmer. But the thing is, again, it doesn't take into consideration what's going on in the real world. For example, if you have a flight simulator, and let's say that this flight simulator wants to be a wise guy, and it allows you can flip a switch in the software and it simulates hitting birds. Okay? Now the bird could hit anywhere on the plane. Now if the bird goes through the engine, you can get something like they had in that Hudson landing, where the plane took off and its engines were basically taken out of commission as it was taking off, and it needed to land in the river. Okay, but the bird could also hit somewhere else. It could hit part of the fuselage and break something. It could hit a probe and break it, and the pilots may never know that it happened, but now this probe doesn't work and it's telling the computers in the aircraft bad information. So then the computers in the aircraft are basing its decisions and what it tells the pilots off of a broken probe, and they don't know it. So the right thing to do might be to pull back on the stick and go up, but instead the computer's telling them to do the opposite, and that's where some of these plane crashes happen from. A flight simulator just can't simulate every single possibility. I mean, what kind of bird was it? Was it a robin? Was it a goose? Did the goose have its head turned sideways when it went into the engine, or did it go straight in? Because, it's got the big beak. Might make a difference. These are the subtle nuances that a computer model can never, ever, ever simulate, because there's just too much. The real world is so complicated. And that's what these computer models with disease do not take into consideration. That's the problem with these things. But when you're just doing a flight simulator, just for the sake of learning how to fly or enjoying flying on your computer, they work magnificently. They're unbelievable accomplishments in computer programming. And, mathematical abstractions of the real world. They're phenomenal. Also, racing simulators. Now, one thing, if you've ever played a racing game, you know, you might even have a wheel. You might even have a one of those computer wheels that you plug into USB, and you can, the pedals down there. Some people even have these big chairs, racing chairs, that have the pedals built in the wheel. And I'm not against it. I think it's fun, to be honest, but I'd probably do that too if I had the money and the space. I love racing games. They're fun. But the fact is, even the best racing games will never be able to anticipate every possibility in the real world. Now, they might take different cars. I mean, I have some racing games where you can go in, and as you make money, you can upgrade all the components. You can upgrade the exhaust, so you get more thrust. You can upgrade the tires. You can upgrade the suspension. You can upgrade parts of the engine. And as you upgrade all of these things, the car starts to perform much better in the simulation. As you're racing, you notice, instead of the car bouncing around like a jalopy at the beginning, the thing's just, you know, as you add this new stuff. It's modeling all of these. Again, for each and every one of those components, it cannot take into consideration every single possibility. What if there's a manufacturing defect in one of the pistons? Now, you can have a computer model that does that. Okay, it randomly, 1 out of 10,000 times that you do a race, a piston will break. Now, I don't know why they would do that. That takes the fun out of it. It makes it more real. But did it break the same way it broke for this person in the real world and that person? No. See, there's so many possibilities. What they tend to do is they just leave that out. They don't have the piston break in the racing game. Ruins your fun, right? But what about things like you're in the car? What if you have a friend in the passenger seat and you want to be wise guys and you start singing a song? You know, you're doing the that, what's that, Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody? You know, they get up to that, and you've got everyone in the car sitting there headbanging to this. Well, as you do that, you're putting all the weight of all these people back and forth on the car. And if you're in a racing car, guess what? That can make your racing car just flip over and everybody flies out and dies. Is the racing simulator going to simulate that? And if so, how? Tell me which key combination simulates the people in the car rocking back and forth, and which key simulates them going back, forward and back. It doesn't do that, does it? It's inferior to the real thing. See, there's a certain level of where a simulator has to be to function as it's intended to function. With a racing or a flight simulator, it is to help you learn and to have fun. Once it's reached that level, it's done its job. And it's almost detrimental. In many ways, these simulators take out the problems, the bad things in the real world, and give you a more perfect version, you know, the idealized version of what it's like to drive a racing car. Also, notice on these racing cars, games, they almost always give you the tracks. Even if they're what they call open-ended, they're limited. There is no way you can take that car that you love in this game and take it down to the field that's out, you know, just down the street from your home. You know that field. You know, you've ridden your bicycle over it since you were a kid. You know every bump and groove. You know exactly how to drive that thing, but you can't do that in the computer program because nobody programmed it in there. Now, taking this a little further, space shuttle flight control simulations. Before an astronaut goes into space, they spend a ton of time in a flight simulator learning how to fly the space shuttle, or when the space shuttle flew. Now, I know a lot about the space shuttle. Again, you know, I have background in, at one point I was trying to do aeronautical engineering before the Challenger explosion and things like that. I have studied the space shuttle systems inside and out. I've also studied like transportation disasters, things of that nature. The flight control simulators are going to help the astronaut when they get into that, when they're strapped in on their back looking up at the sky with this rocket behind them, hoping that it gets them up there, and when they take off they're shaking more violently than they've ever felt in their lives. They have to know what's going on with these controls. Well, they get that through a simulator. Likewise, the mission control has their own simulators. They up on all those monitors on the walls, the guys sitting at the desks, they are simulating assisting a shuttle with one of its missions. And that's how those people learn how to do things before it happens in the real world. So again, these are simulations. They have a definite purpose. The intent of the programmer is key with these. And then there's others too that come under like video games, railroad simulators, roller coaster simulators like Roller Coaster Tycoon. What about Sim City? Classic, very popular video game. It's simulating basically being the governor, you might say, of this state or this city. And every time you do something here and it's going well, some fire starts up over here. A warehouse burns down, or Karl Marx moves into town, or something causes problems, and you got to keep whacking them all. And there aren't many people who can play that game without having their city just descend into absolute chaos, right? But it is not simulating everything that goes on. It's simulating at a very high level. It's not, even the ones that allow you to walk into a building and see little people walking around in there, you don't know every detail about each of these individuals' lives. There's a limit to what you can do with the simulation. Now, what these individuals are doing, you might walk into a room when you're playing SimCity and see a bunch of people walking around in an office building, for example. But if they're just walking around, they're just there for the sake of letting you see them walk around. It gives you an emotional high while you're playing the game. It feels more real. But what if you're a disease model? You're trying to model how people actually move around in the real world. That's silly. I mean, in that context, these people moving around in the building in SimCity, they're like that football game I had when I was a kid, and you had those little stick guys, you'd put them on there, and then the football field would vibrate, and these guys would just bounce around in random directions and once in a while hit each other. I mean, that's what that is. That's what the computer models at the CDC treat human beings like. Because human beings are complex, very, very complex. They are the most complex things in this world. Each one of those people, each one of those little figures in SimCity walking around has a life story. And they have a destiny. And they're in the process of going through all that, navigating that life. There's no model that could conceivably come close to that. And this is really what I'm getting at when it comes to the computer models. But let's hang off of that for a little bit. Now again, these simulators are often used for games and training. That's the main purpose of them. They are good for training. Again, I wouldn't want to get into a space shuttle the first time in a situation where I'm totally strapped in and I can only move my arms and I can't even move my shoulders, and the violence of the shaking and everything. I would like to have a simulator to teach me where all these switches are and what they do, so that I know what I'm doing when I get in there. And without that simulator, wow. I have to assume that Young and Crippen were using simulators even back in 1980, before that shuttle took off the first time. But the simulations are limited. Even the best of the best of the best of the best, the award winners among that group, are still incredibly limited versus what actually happens in the real world. But the thing is, they often don't need to do more than they do, as long as they accomplish their intent, which is determined by a human. Humans run the show. Don't ever think the computers run the show. Humans always ultimately run the show here. Well, frankly, God always runs the show, but I mean in terms of us programming computers and creating these things. Simulators are also very useful for air crash investigators. They can take black box data from a crash site. They can take all the data in there, plug it into a flight simulator, and then let it run, and it will show you exactly what happened with that aircraft before it crashed, because it already has the data. It's like doing it in reverse. So it'll show you, oh, hey, it started banking, it started going out of control here. Now let's look at what the pilots did. Did they flip the switch? Yes, they did. And that's how you investigate and you track down what ultimately caused these air crashes. So a simulator can be used in reverse like that as a troubleshooting after the fact. But again, it's the human being who is interpreting that. The simulator itself isn't capable of telling you. You don't just put black box data into a simulator, push a button, and then the computer comes back and says, it was a bad valve in the de-icing system. You know, here, part number, serial number, this. The computer doesn't do that. It doesn't do anything of the kind. All it does is basically give you a video game like some 10-year-old kid has in his bedroom, shows you what the plane was doing. It's the human being who can think, who takes that information along with other information and does the investigation. People who study these kinds of disasters are unbelievable what they accomplish. You think CSI is something, it is. You know, CSI is very impressive. I'm not as impressive to me as these disaster investigators, but again, I just want to make the point, it's up to human beings, not the computers. People control the computers. We program the computers. The computer can only do what we have told it to do. Reminds me of that movie, that Stephen King movie that he wrote and directed, Maximum Overdrive, which a lot of people hate. I like the movie. I don't know why. Maybe because of the time it came out in the 80s. But all these machines start coming alive, and they start basically imprison these people in this gas station. And the people can't get out, or they'll get run over by a truck or some mechanical device or something. It's actually a throwback to an old sci-fi story in the 1950s. X-1 had an episode similar to that. But in the scene, one of the ladies who's imprisoned there, she finally just loses it, just loses control and goes crazy. And she goes out there and she starts screaming at these vehicles. They even had an army vehicle with a machine gun pointed at the door. And she comes out there and she's like, "We created you! We created you!" And it's basically her way of making an argument to these machines. Leave us alone. We're in charge, not you. And of course she got shot and turned into mincemeat by the machine gun truck. But that's a movie, you see. That's called science fiction. In the real world, that doesn't happen, does it? And you can program these devices. You can program self-moving cars till the end of time. They will never be able. They will be able to do things like a drone to go over there and shoot somebody. They might even be able to go over there and listen to what the person's screaming at them, and based on what they're saying, make a decision, a logical decision, not a thinking decision, but a logical, programmed decision, shoot or don't shoot. But that thing will never do what a human being could do, ever. Not even close. When the Space Shuttle Columbia, remember Space Shuttle Columbia, when that disintegrated as it was coming in for a landing, it's a glider when it's landing, and it disintegrated. And I know the Challenger and the Columbia stories as well as anyone at NASA, I would say. I have studied those. Every year on the dates, I will listen to the mission control. Just like on the 4th of July, I will always read the Constitution and Declaration of Independence. On the anniversaries of those disasters, I always go back and I listen to the events, because I don't ever want to forget what happened there. I don't ever want to forget it. When the Columbia disintegrated, parts of it would fall off, and then they would fall through the sky to the ground. Now what they did was they made a map of where this particular item, this part of the engine casing on the right side, fell and landed here in Arizona. This leading edge of the wing piece fell off and landed in California. Okay, here's part of the bay door. Part of the bay door fell and it landed here in Texas. And they map all that out. And then, now they're making some assumptions, but they're basically saying, well, we know what height it was at, we know what attitude and altitude it was at, we know what it was doing, what would it take for that piece to fall and land at that location where it was found? And if you kind of reverse engineer that with a simulator, then you can determine how the thing fell apart. And if you do that, then you look at where's the first part that fell apart, and there's your suspect for what caused the disaster. And that's one of the tools that they use to discover that. It's absolutely amazing. But it was the human beings who came up with the answer. They didn't just take that data, put it in a computer, and the computer spits back and says, you know, well, it was hit by a piece of foam when the space shuttle took off. It was hit by a piece of foam that fell off of the external fuel tank. It punched a hole in it. When it came in for landing, the superheated gases went in there and just basically melted the left wing over the course of a couple of minutes, and at some point the whole thing just disintegrated, went out of control, and fell to the ground. There's no computer program that's going to tell you that. Not a chance. It was human beings interpreting things that figured out what was going on. Let's see here. Now, in transportation disasters in particular, like an air crash or something, if it was determined that it's caused by pilot error, a different type of investigator will be called in at that point. They're called human performance investigators. These are people who are studying the human aspect, which ultimately is key. In theory, you could call in a human performance investigator every time, even if it was a maintenance problem. Study why is there this culture in the maintenance system that allowed this problem to slip through, for example. Ultimately, humans are responsible for everything. You can blame it on anything you want, but somewhere along the lines it came down to people didn't have enough foresight, didn't pay enough attention, didn't take it far enough, etc. Or the opposite, they took it too far, which is what we got here with coronavirus. Human performance is ultimately responsible, and that's why I want to make these videos, to make the point that the reason these people are suffering, ultimately, the buck stops with Governor Tim Walz. He's the one making these decisions. And if he's going to make these decisions off of a complete misunderstanding of what a computer model is, the buck stops with him. So when these people come in, the human performance investigators, they're going to do a lot of investigation of the people. Like when this Malaysian Air, was it Flight 420, I think? I'm not sure of the number, but the one that disappeared. I mean, this airliner just disappears, right, over what, the Indian Ocean? How does a jetliner just disappear like that? Well, they called in people to study the pilots. Were these pilots the type who might want to commit suicide or do something nefarious? But for the most part, what they're going to do, if they have pilot error, they're going to study, first of all, did they follow standard operating procedure? So the pilots have a manual, they have checklists, they have a specific time within the flight that they have to carry out that checklist. If you do it later, you're going to have a problem. And what they find in many cases when it's pilot error, one of the leading causes of pilot error is fatigue caused by sleep deprivation. And that's part of the culture of how these pilots move and travel. They one flight after another, they have to stand up in an airport, go through all these lines. Sometimes they're not put up in a hotel properly. But sleep deprivation, and in fact, when you get into transportation, when you get into disasters generally, even engineering disasters, sleep deprivation and fatigue of the human being who built and designed and maintained it is one of the biggest causes of these. And I just want to throw in an aside here. I have to. When I lost my home because my neighbors tortured and terrorized me with noise, violent, loud shaking of the building noise for years, and nobody did anything about it. Nobody in Minnesota government would enforce the law, do anything to help me. One of the consequences of that is that I could no longer sleep. I couldn't get normal sleep. My sleep was interrupted constantly. I couldn't get to sleep. I was just shaking. I was just a bowl of jelly inside my own home. Well, when that happens, your performance in every area starts to degrade. And I tried telling people that. I still think that one of the reasons I was selected along with all these other people to lose their job at the time when I had the job at the medical supply or the medical device company, I think one of the reasons is because, I was trying to improve a lot of things that were going on there that were really pretty wrong. And you have to play that political game subtly. But with all the sleep deprivation I had, I wasn't really doing that very well. I was a little louder and more boisterous about it than I probably should have been. That might be one reason why I lost my job. But either way, just in terms of doing the stuff I was doing, all the projects I was doing, the writing, what I meant to do with my home recording studio, I had so many projects going on, I couldn't perform well anymore because my neighbors made so much noise. Well, that's something that a human performance investigator is going to determine as the cause of an air crash. But it all started with what? It all started with things like black box information, a computer simulation that showed what happened to the plane. See, it's just one of the whole chain of investigation. The modeling simulation is just one part of it. Just one part of it. You don't base everything on what the model says or some person's interpretation of what the model says. That's lunacy. That is sheer lunacy, especially when you're dealing with uncharted territories like a pandemic, for example. We don't have a lot of pandemics, do we? I mean, when's the last time this kind of nonsense happened? There have been some that have killed a lot of people in the 20th century, and I don't just mean the Spanish flu. There's been others throughout the century in various parts of the world. And more recently, in just in the last 10, 20 years, you've heard about SARS and MERS and all that, and they were always brought up as being, oh, everybody's going to die, and it never happened. We don't have a lot of understanding of how pandemics work, and I'm going to go into why a little later, but it has to do with the fact that there's 7 billion people, 7.6 billion people in the world, and they're unique, independent beings with free will. There is no computer simulation that can tell you what these people are going to do, where they're going to go. And Google can sit there and try to track you by your phone till the end of time, but that doesn't tell you everything either. Because all Google sees is where you went today and yesterday and the day before. That does not predict where you're going to go tomorrow. Because you are a human being. You think, unlike Google's computers. It's the problem with tracking information of people all along. Remember, I mean, I wrote that book back in 1996, warning about weaponization of personal information, which includes things like tracking. Because it doesn't tell you the whole story about what this person is. And if you're trying to track 400 million people who are sitting in the United States of America, there is no computer at the CDC that can tell you what these people are going to do and why, and what factors are going to make them change their behavior. Look at part one of the, or no, not part of one of this, but 2 videos back, I showed you how the National Weather Service report made even me change my behavior as a precaution for my safety. And it turned out to be for no good reason, because the storm never even happened. What do you think's going on here with the CDC and the World Health Organization and all of their computer models? Sometimes you have to just inject human thought, common sense. One thing we knew for certain about this was that if 100 people get coronavirus, even at the worst, the numbers were like 4 out of 100 would die from it. The real numbers, it became clear, and I think now people are finally starting to figure out, the real numbers are a lot less. Like less than 1 probably. I don't know what the exact number is, but it could be as small as like, 1/10 of 1% of people who get coronavirus die from it. Because we don't know. We never did have all the data that this computer program needs anyway. That's another reason these computer models are junk at the CDC. It's possible that 3/4 of the American population already had coronavirus, and they just got over it. They didn't even know they had it because it was so little impact on them. Well, if that's the case, then why are we shutting down the country? Because the computer model assumes that nobody's had it yet, so it's just doing all this spread of, the disease is going to spread here and here and here, but if everyone's already had it and they built up immunities to it, then there's no problem. There's absolutely no reason to shut down a society. Alright? So, but going back to the human performance investigators, they're checking to see whether people obeyed standard operating procedures. Did they obey the checklists? Did they do what they're supposed to do, what their training told them to do? Now, sometimes it turns out that the training told them to do something that was monumentally stupid. And it caused a plane to crash, and it caused hundreds of people to die. Because their training told them to do the wrong thing. In other words, the experts told these pilots to do something that would ultimately end up killing hundreds of people. Now, whose fault was that? Was it the people's fault for getting on a plane knowing, hey, if a plane goes up, what goes up must come down. If I get on that plane, I could die in a crash. Is it their fault? Because that's what the CDC would say, or Governor Tim Walz, right? Well, if you go to work, you're bringing this on yourself. There's this disease out there. And so we have to treat you like a little child, pat you on the head, and we have to tell you, you can't go to school today. You can't go to work. You can't take care of your family. You can't behave like a responsible adult. You can't behave like a free and independent human being. Because we're government and we're going to tell you what to do and take control of everything. Okay, well, if it wasn't the passengers who caused the plane crash or who are responsible for their deaths, was it the pilots? The pilots did exactly what they were trained to do. They signed off, they put their initials, they did exactly what they were told to do. But what if the pilots kind of sense that, hey, you know, this doesn't really make a lot of sense. The manual says to do it. If I don't do it, I'll get fired. And yet, I don't know for sure. I'm on a plane right now. I can't research it. You know, this isn't the time to not do it because those people who told me to do it are experts. So I'm going to do it. Flip the switch. Was it the pilot's fault? They followed the instructions the experts told them. They followed what their bosses told them to do. Under no circumstances do you deviate from standard operating procedures. Well, what about the experts? The experts who wrote the manual that told the pilots to do that. I mean, I hope you can see where I'm going with this. Ultimately, it comes down, you can sit there and you can blame other people till the end of time. But who wrote the procedure that told them to flip the switch that ended up under this circumstance causing the plane to crash and all those people to die? It was the experts. It was the people writing the manual, doing the training, the people in charge. Now, they didn't mean to, but they're humans. They're flawed just like everyone else. They're not going to do that deliberately and put it in there to get people hurt or killed. But people, you know what, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. At some point, common sense needs to take over when the experts go berserk and they don't know what they're doing. At some point, the masses, the passengers on this plane of ours, needs to take over and say, I'm not getting on this plane because the wing's about ready to fall off. And the experts over there will not listen to us when we keep telling them the wing's about to fall off. That's like the American people saying, look, less than 1% of people who even get coronavirus die from it. Most of them have a pre-existing condition. They've got pneumonia or cancer. They're old, so their immune systems are degraded already, or they've got AIDS or something like that. I'm at no real practical risk of dying from coronavirus. But these experts won't listen to a word I'm saying. The only one who listens to these experts are the governors. So they shut down society, they destroy your life, all the wealth and everything that you build up over your lifetime. They take away your ability to take responsibility for your own family's safety and security and prosperity, paying the bills. And they're doing it based on the one element in this whole situation who knows the least about what's really going on. This is the problem. Because remember, a computer model is created by human beings. And it's going to model what those human beings have going on in their minds. Those experts at the CDC are the ones creating these computer models. And they are doing the worst thinking of anybody in our society today, except for the lemmings who just sit there and obey and put on a mask and, oh my God, we're all going to die. Alright? So there's a different type of, let me move on here, there's a different type of modeling that I would call design and validation modeling. For example, if you're going to design an aircraft and you want to design something that's going to make sure that it flies, that it goes through the air smoothly, and that the control surfaces will interact with the I'm sorry, I've got to just show you this. This is a shutdown order. It is 8 o'clock at night. I'm off the street behind a business that isn't open and hasn't been open forever. And, okay, that truck's always there. This car just pulled in right in front of me. Okay, that van is just sitting there. It's been sitting there forever. It's one of the ones that had its cat stolen. And this car just pulls in right in front of me. 8 p.m., stay-at-home order. Off the road, out in the middle of nowhere. This is my point. I can't get a moment's peace to do anything. It's amazing that I even get these videos done at all. But design and validation, if you're going to build an aircraft, you can do simulations before you build the aircraft. You can have a pretty good idea of how well it's going to fly, how stable it's going to be, how easy it will be for the pilots to control it. You have some idea, but it's based on very high-level understanding of aerodynamics and performance, based on what's happened with previous aircraft. It's extremely useful. It's a very good starting point, and in that case, a modeler is a very good tool for people. The same thing is true for architects. If you want to build buildings like high-rise building, how is it going to stand up to stresses like high winds? We're in a hurricane zone. How is it going to stand up to that? How is it going to stand up to earthquakes? How's it going to stand up to, say, a fully loaded airplane full of jet fuel smashing into it? Because the people who built the World Trade Center, when they designed it, they, on paper, not with a computer, but on paper, they built it to withstand being hit by a fully loaded jet aircraft. But that's another story. What if you're a metallurgist and you want to, you want to know whether these parts that are made out of this alloy you're coming up with, how strong is it going to be? How's it going to handle different forces and tensions on it? You can use computer modeling to get some idea, some starting point. And it can save a lot of time and money and research building prototypes and things by doing the modeling first. Validation software, if you have an electronic device, like let's say when I was in medical devices, if you have something that, say, for people with diabetes, it's an insulin pump. It has software in it. Well, you can write a validation program that runs through all the possible combinations of software inputs and changing the settings on this, all the different combinations, to test whether or not the thing locks up, stops working or something. Okay, for a human to do that would take a long time. They'd have to draw out this big chart, well, you push button A and you twist dial C, and you have the brightness set at 20% on the LCD screen. You see how many possible combinations there are. Well, a good validation software is going to take all the possible combinations of that, and it might take even weeks to run this validation on just one little device, like a pump, like an insulin pump. Now, if you do that, and if the validation software itself, the modeler, if it is done well, it can catch a lot of problems before they manifest themselves in the real world, which with an insulin pump could cause someone to die. So, see, those are the kind of modelers that are very, very useful, but they never will replace human intelligence, ever. They can't do it. And you know what? We're at 1 hour, which I really did not expect. So what I'm going to have to do is part 3. Alright, so thank you so much for watching this video. I'll get cracking on the part 3, which should be the last one. Thank you again so much for watching. Look forward to having you come back.